My name is Garret Doocey, I'm Principal Officer here in the Department of Transport, and I'm currently leading on the development of a new sustainable mobility policy, which effectively is a new active travel and public transport policy for the department and obviously for the country itself. So this new policy will effectively replace the existing policy frameworks, which many of you will be aware of, smarter travel in the area, the general area, and also the National Cycle Policy Framework dating both back to 2009. If we move on to the next slide there, please. Just in terms of today's presentation, I'll start off with just explaining a little bit in terms of the overarching policy target. We'll work then in many of the existing frameworks you already heard referenced in previous contributions, and just the alignment of this new policy with those. Talk through a little then on the stakeholder engagement that's been undertaken thus far and has really very greatly informed the development of the new policy. Then delve into the policy itself a little bit, explain its structure, explain its framework. So we've got a vision, principles and goals. Describe, and this will be, I know, of interest to many, the funding streams that are available to ensure implementation of the actual policy, and then just taking today's theme of 10-minute towns and 15-minute cities, etc. And the Minister will refer to this himself, transport-led development, just looking at one specific goal in a little bit more detail and exploring the draft actions that are proposed in it, and then concluding on some actual tangible real-life examples of transport-led development that are happening at the minute around the country. If we move on then to the next slide, please. So in terms of the overall policy and its overarching target, our ambition at the end of this policy, which will be 2030, is that we achieve 500,000 additional daily active travel and public transport journeys by 2030. Along with demand management measures, we would also estimate a reduction in ICE car kilometres by about 10%, and cumulatively that will result in around a 1.4 megaton CO2 reduction. And though that target and the description of it, that's very much grounded in the Climate Action Plan, which obviously previous speakers would have alluded to. So this sustainable mobility policy is pretty much the sectoral face to really the targets that have been set by central government to the transport sector and the active travel and public transport elements of that transport sector in particular. If we move on then to the next slide, please. So just in terms of alignment with existing frameworks, obviously the policy is not being developed in isolation. It speaks to both international, EU and national frameworks, and a number of these would have been referenced earlier on. In terms of our international frameworks, obviously there's United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Development Goal number 11, number 13 of particular importance there in terms of sustainable cities and communities and climate action, but also a number of the other goals as well are directly relevant. There's the Paris Climate Agreement and its successors. And then there's the recently published EU Sustainable Smart Mobility Strategy, which established 10 flagships across the transport sector, which was including aviation and maritime, so much broader than just the active travel and public transport focus of this particular policy. But of those 10 flagships, there's certainly 5 which speak directly really to our own policy development. At a national level then, obviously we've got the National Planning Framework, we've got the Climate Action Plan, other complementary policies and strategies at government level which we're looking to support, such as Housing for All. We have the National Investment Framework for Transport in Ireland, which my colleague Tomas and Kyle will be speaking about later on as well. And I also mentioned there's some recent work by the OECD, Transport Strategies for Net Zero Systems by Design. And again, that's a piece of work that we do consider our own policy to be very closely aligned with and supportive and complementary to. We might move on then to the next slide, please. So just in terms of how we got here and where we started from, I suppose, really work on the policy kicked off back in 2018 when there was a roundtable held by the then Minister Shane Ross in Dublin's Mansion House, which gathered together, I can't quite remember how many stakeholders, but there was a large number for a day-long event in the Mansion House, in which there was a variety of views and opinions expressed on the future of sustainable mobility in Ireland. And following that roundtable event, the department developed a series of 9 or 10 very detailed background papers covering a whole range of issues and topics in the area, and published them toward the end of 2019. And at that time, it was in October, we held a further stakeholder engagement event just as we kicked off the public consultation proper on the review of sustainable mobility policy. And that public consultation continued into early 2020, and we received around 250 plus submissions as a result of that. And that really informed and guided our consideration of the issues, and certainly was really useful in the development of the policy framework itself. And then last year, we held a number of bilateral stakeholder meetings with a wide range of stakeholders, a number of whom there on the screen in front of you, including not just government departments, regional assemblies, etc., but also advocacy groups such as the Irish Pedestrian Network, Cyclist.ie, the Dublin Commuter Coalition, the Accessibility Consultative Committee, etc. So it was a really useful exercise, building on the kind of broader public consultation and stakeholder engagement events held previously. And then last year's engagements were really more focused discussions with stakeholders on elements of the emerging policy framework, and really sense checking our kind of direction of travel. So if we move on then to the next slide, please. I suppose another piece of the engagement that was really useful in informing our approach to the policy was working with the OECD as they launched and undertook an environmental performance review of Ireland, which was published last year, I think it was. So we had asked the OECD through our colleagues in the Department of Environment and Climate Action that the OECD include a specific chapter on sustainable mobility policy as a kind of special or additional chapter in that piece of work. And what the OECD concluded as they look back on smarter travel and its implementation, they made a number of very interesting observations which were really useful to us as we looked to develop the new policy structure. So one, they pointed out, there was a lack of effective implementation. Secondly, they considered that the actions themselves in the previous policy were perhaps underdeveloped or possibly even inappropriate in terms of the targets that were being set to be achieved. And they also highlighted the importance of establishing a clear implementation plan, defining a clear budget, and also being very clear and clear about the responsibilities of the various action owners and setting out who those action owners are and what was expected of them. So that was really useful in terms of our own thoughts as to how to approach this new policy. So what we've done is, in terms of the structure of the policy document itself, I suppose we've got a policy statement, which is a 10-year horizon looking out to 2030. So it sets the vision, establishes the 3 principles, which we'll talk about in a second, the 10 high-level goals, those targets we mentioned earlier on, and is looking to set some KPIs then just in terms of measuring our progress towards those overarching targets. And really it's the narrative behind the overall policy. And then separately, we've got an action plan, which is much tighter and is simply that. It is an action plan. It is a list of actions, and its time frame is out to 2025. It has approximately 80 actions in them. For each action, there's a timeline, there's an owner, and any supporting actors involved as well are also listed. And each of those actions then are grouped under the 10 high-level goals. So there's a clear pathway established between the policy vision, the principles, the goals, and then these specific actions, each supporting the various goals as well. So if you move on then to the next slide. So this is the draft policy vision and draft policy framework, and I'm using the word draft there deliberately as we are in the process of going to government at the moment. We've had internal discussion and agreement on it, and we're now, the ministers instructed us to commence formally the formal process of government approval. So that's underway, and we expect to have government approval by March, but there may be elements of this that may change slightly. However, broadly, I think it's more or less there. So the vision is to connect people and places with sustainable mobility that's safe, green, accessible and efficient. And then the policy framework, as I mentioned, it's centered around 3 principles. So we've got safe and green mobility, people-focused mobility and better integrated mobility. And then under each of those 3 principles, we have a number of goals, 10 in total. So if you look at safe and green mobility, we've got obviously at the start there, ensure continued mobility safely. Decarbonisation of public transport coming in number 2 there, and I know the Minister himself referred to that earlier on, his contribution. 3 and 4 is around expanding availability of sustainable mobility in the metropolitan areas, the 5 cities, and then in rural and regional areas as well. So this is really, the actions in this space are around about, bus connects in the cities, connecting Ireland in rural and regional areas, active travel infrastructure in the major cities, and including active travel infrastructure then in the regional growth centres, key towns and villages, etc. as well. Number 5 is encourage people to choose sustainable mobility over the private car, and this is really around behavioural change and demand management measures. That's the type of actions that are sitting in that particular one. Moving on to people-focused mobility then, 6 and 7 are really around a whole of journey approach and inclusive accessibility, and also when designing infrastructure according to the universal design principles and enshrining the hierarchy of road users model at a policy level as well. Number 8 is really building on the engagement that we've had, or look to build on the engagement that we've had in the development of this policy, and maintain that level of engagement with both citizens and other groups in terms of the promotion of sustainable mobility in the years ahead. And then the final principle is better integrated mobility, and there's 2 goals under that, as you can see there on the screen. And number 9 is one I'll talk to a little bit further, and number 10 speaks, I think, to Kevin's comment earlier on around smart mobility and evolving technologies, etc., and the development of appropriate regulation with respect to that as well. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So importantly, and again, this is taking from a lesson learned from the OECD review of the last policy, there is a very clear funding stream established for this policy, and what we've done is we've aligned the temporal kind of horizon of the policy with the National Development Plan as well, which further embeds, I think, really that linkage between the NDP funding stream and the policy ambition. So transport as a whole secured €35 billion out to 2030 under the National Development Plan, and obviously the money related to the implementation of active travel and public transport infrastructure will be derived from that €35 billion. So that's very useful, and it's a really strong platform to build on in terms of the implementation over the years ahead. But of course, in public transport in particular, there's also a need for current expenditure to support PSO services in particular, and those PSO services are managed on an annual basis, and that will continue to be managed on an annual basis through the normal budgetary process. But to give a flavour, I mean, this year alone, €538 million was allocated to public transport services, the PSO programme, in 2022, and colleagues are engaged with, or will be engaging with, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform on a review of the PSO programme generally as well. But that gives an indication of the scale of investment, I think, through the current expenditure programme as well. If we move on then to the next slide, please. So I mentioned we just take a moment or two just to have a look underneath the bonnet, so to speak, in terms of one of the goals. So this is goal 9, the better integration of land use and transport planning, and speaks to a number of the contributions made earlier on around the 10-minute town, 15-minute neighbourhood as well. But I wouldn't like to leave an impression that this is just it in terms of this policy and the supports it can potentially offer those concepts. Obviously, there's a lot of other actions in terms of supporting permeability and active travel elsewhere in the policy framework, particularly around goals 6 and 7, which also I think will be of real use to local authorities across the country in terms of better integration of land use and transport planning, and also the promotion of the concepts of 10-minute towns, etc. But if we look at goal 9 in particular, it's around better integration of land use and transport planning, and it has 5 separate actions in here, 3 of which are new or expanded actions. So we got extending the statutory transport planning remit of the NTA to the other metropolitan areas. There's an action gone in around ensuring that the reviews of the resources include an analysis of land use development potential based on accessibility to the proposed core public transport network. And that concept is coming from, if people are familiar with the review of the GDA transport strategy at the minute, there's an interesting section in it in this space toward the end of the document, and that's something we'd like to see rolled out more generally as well, and when we get to the reviews of the resources. It's been mentioned, I think, already this morning around local transport plans. So there's a commitment here to fund, prepare and commence implementation of the local transport plans for the regional growth centres in the key towns, having regard to the area-based transport assessment guidance by the NTA, and I think Owen may speak to that later on in his presentation. Obviously then continuing action is to deliver the actual metropolitan area transport strategies in the cities. We don't just want to develop these strategies, we want to see them delivered. And then a complementary action which is coming from one of those other policy frameworks of government that I spoke to earlier on, Housing for All. There's an action in it to establish a working group between ourselves, a number of other agencies, the NTA and the LDA in particular, to consider transport-led development in the major urban centres. And that working group was established just before Christmas, and we're just working up our terms of reference now with a meeting, I think second meeting in a couple of weeks' time. If we move on then to the next slide. And while we've been speaking a lot about policy frameworks and high-level strategic direction, I suppose it's worth just taking a moment to reflect on the ground works that are underway or are about to commence across the country, really, which show the potential, I think, afforded by both these policy frameworks and the funding envelope that is now currently available. So in terms of these examples here, Adamstown is the first one on the screen there, and that is a picture there of construction that's underway just around the train station, for those of you who are familiar with Adamstown on the Dublin-Cork main line. Adamstown, the SDZ, has been there for many years, 15 or 16 years now at this stage, if not a little bit longer. Potential housing development potential of up to around 8,500 to 9,000 units. There's 975 units going in around the station, as well as a huge commercial and retail development as well. And the funding streams for that are, there's a URDF contribution going in terms of a new civic plaza and library, I think. And also, of course, the Department of Transport has been funding it. We would have funded the forward tracking of the Kildare line back in the mid-2000s. And then there's a huge funding stream going in through the DART Plus programme as well to extend DART services out to that part of the network as well. So that mix of funding is something that's evident across these other examples as well. If we turned out to Oranmore and Galway, again, the funding streams here are a mix of URDF and Department of Transport funding as well. There's a housing potential for 1,100 units. And these housing developments in all of these locations are very much attuned with the 10-minute town concept described earlier on, where active travel is prioritised for local journeys, but then there's high capacity public transport to bring people in and out of major urban centres as well. So the funding here, it's a mix of URDF funding going to Galway County Council to develop a master plan for that area outlined in red. And then there's actual funding being allocated toward the construction now of an additional platform and track infrastructure at the existing Oranmore station. And that funding then is also being complemented by funding from ourselves through the NTA, which will see, of course, then you'll see the transport infrastructure go in long in advance of the later housing development that we all hope to see there. Talbot and Limerick is another great example. Very much one of those key projects that the LDA is leading on in terms of bringing together the various state actors in the area and the various parcels of land, a housing potential for up to 2,800 units. Funding from NTA through ourselves through the NTA is being used to redevelop the station itself, and the LDA will be finalising and publishing the spatial framework for the area sometime in the early part of this year, I think it is. The North Quays down in Waterford, no doubt there's people on the call familiar with it, just as with Limerick as well. Again, funding, a mix of funding here from URDF and Department of Transport through the NTA in terms of the bridge, and then URDF in terms of the movement of the train station. And that's, a fantastic regeneration project down in Waterford, with really the potential to really kickstart developments in terms of, obviously on the northern side, but also create those new linkages between north and south through the Department of Transport NTA funded bridge linking both. And then Cork, again, no doubt there's plenty on the call familiar with the Cork Docklands, which is a massive regeneration project in total, and has a number of different moving parts, of course, as well. But interestingly, its funding, ultimately will be URDF, there'll be Department of Transport funding, and then the Minister himself referred to the fact that we're also using EU Recovery and Resilience Facility funding there in terms of phase 1 of the Cork Commuter Rail programme, which is hugely integral to the overall plan, particularly the Tivoli site, which is the one in the picture there as well. So that's just a couple of examples of progress on the ground across the country as we speak, and also I think shows the potential for the various authorities across the country to maximise funding opportunities through different funding streams that are now available and are there to be utilised. If we move on then to the next slide, please. So then to conclude, with where we are, I mentioned in terms of the new policy, the intention is to publish that policy in Q1. That's a climate action plan target to have it published in Q1. We are very well advanced and working toward that target, and we're just commencing the formal government approval process now over the next few weeks. So that I would expect to see a new policy published by the end of March. And the Interdepartmental Working Group, that's specifically in relation to the transport-led development and the Housing for All action. And as I mentioned, that group has been established just before Christmas, is meeting again, I think very shortly, next week or so, and we're just working on the terms of reference for it. And then as part of the policy, and I mentioned the OECD's review earlier on, and one of the criticisms it had of the previous policy and implementation was the lack of effective implementation. So as part of that, we will be looking to establish part of the new policy's implementation, rather. We'll be looking to establish a leadership group to ensure that we really do drive delivery. And we think an important part of keeping focus on delivery will be the fact that we split out the actions into a much tighter 2025 horizon, which then behoves us all really to go back in 2020, late 24, early 25, and look back at those actions to see how we've implemented them and effectively put in new actions to ensure that we hit the overall target by 2030. So thanks very much for the opportunity again to speak today, and happy to take any questions.